We're making a connection to the JSON placeholder in this lesson where the user can select the post that they want to get and see the post content being output on the page. And it's just being added to the top by the ID value of the post. So there's a number of posts, and this is just creating the user interaction. And when we do make the selection, we click the button, it makes the request to the endpoint according to whatever the ID value is we have on the input, and it returns back the corresponding content, and then we're using that JSON object and outputting it to the page. So open up the editor and create index.html, and you can reuse the same file as we did before. Just change the source code, and I've changed it to code5.js, and I've kept some of the values from the last lesson as well. So all of the selection of the elements from the page, also updating the input value to hello world, and then adding an event listener to the button. And right now what happens is when we click the button, it loads the value of ready into the console. We're going to be using the JSON placeholder. So this is available at jsonplaceholder.typecode.com, and what it is, it's a free to use fake online REST API, and allows you to do some testing and making fetch requests to the API. So they do have an example here, and it will show you what gets returned back. So there is a response back. So let's go ahead and we'll make a connection to the endpoint and return back the data from the endpoint whenever the button gets clicked. And there's a few different endpoints as well. And there's more information available within the guide page. And you can request to posts. You can create a resource as well. And then you can update a resource. So there's a number of options here for different paths that we can connect to. So let's set up our base URL. And we can just call this the base URL. And this is going to be the URL that we're going to be using to make the fetch request. I'm going to update the view to toggle the word wrap for the editor so that we can see all of the contents. And for now, what we want to do is we want to connect to the endpoint and output the content on the page. So let's construct our URL. So using the base URL and add to it. And let's see what endpoint we can add to. So we'll do the posts one. So it's going to return back the first post within the API. And then using fetch request to the URL. And then once we get the response object, we return back the response, and it is going to be JSON formatted. So we can just return it back as JSON. Then we can get the content back as data and then output it into the console using the console log. So let's see what happens. We click and we get this information back from the endpoint. So we get a body, title, and information. So how about we output that to the page? And we'll just do add to page. And we'll pass in the page info that we want to add to the page. And so that will be contained within the data object. And in this case, we're getting the body, ID, and title. And also, usually I do like to use the console to output the page content. So let's construct the page content, and we're going to add it into the output object. And create a function to add the element. So for that, we need the parent. And this is the same that we've done before. And the type, we can just give it a variable of t. And also the HTML content that we want to add. And using the constructor, we're going to create an element, document, create element. The element that we're creating is going to be whatever the type is that we've called in. and then taking the parent object, append to the parent the element that we just created, and then within the element, update the inner HTML of the element to equal whatever the contents of the HTML is going to be. And then lastly, we return back the element to the original one that called the element content. So create the div where we just add the element, and the parent is going to be output. The type of element that we're adding is going to be a div, and then we're not going to pass in any content in there. So this is going to be our main container. Let's click it one more time so we can get the object information. So let's add to the object, and we'll create another one that will be, call it item, and then we can also do the add element here as well, and this is going to be appended to main. This can also be a div, and then the content here that we're going to pass in, we'll give it a variable of whatever HTML, so that way we can construct it outside of the function request. And using the template literals, let's output the title content. So we've got it under info, title, and I'll set this as an H1 and close off the H1, and also update this to let so that I can add to the HTML object. And next up, let's do the body. So that can be contained within a paragraph. And that's under info body. And then lastly, we'll add one more line, and this can be within the small tags. And that can just contain the ID. And as well, let's add in the user ID. So that gives us all of the information that is returned back. So user ID. And now let's try it. So that outputs the content to the page, and then we can make additional requests to that content and return it back. So we're returning it back and we're requesting by ID. So let's make an update to the input field, and instead of having a value of hello world, we'll give it a value of 1. And then the input element, let's set the attribute, and we'll update the type, setting the type to be number type. And also update the width of the element, so it's rather wide right now, and give it a class of number. So let's set the font size, so make it fairly large. Set the width, and I'm going to actually do a max width of it to be max of 70 pixels. And then let's add the class to that element. So input element, using class list to add a class of number. So that gives us a nice big number. So let's get the value from the input, and we can just simply add it to the posts. So that's number 1. That's with the ID number 2. With the ID number 3, let's go back to 1. So that again returns back the one with ID number 1. So we're able to select the post that we want to output the content from and output it to the page. And that creates the interaction. And I'll also update the button and text content, select post. So that allows us to make a selection of the different posts and output them into the page. And if we want to move it right up at the top, instead of append, let's do a prepend. So what this will do is this will add the newest post to the top so that we don't always have to scroll down to see which one has been added. Also going to apply some quick styling to that. So let's create a class of box. So create a border around it so that we can distinguish between the different posts. Also add a border radius so it's slightly rounded, and then some padding for the content. Also adding in the box sizing, so using the border box, and save that. And also let's do a margin. And left and right can be auto. And we'll set a width of this to be 80 pixels so that's centered. And let's see what that looks like. And of course we need to still apply. So within the main class list, add the box style. So that way we're outputting the contents on the page. In this lesson, make the connection to the JSON endpoint, create the user selected response data, and output it to the web page, practice and try out the different endpoints, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson. We're going to continue to work with the JSON placeholder API.